enlightened craftsmen, insane scientists, and individuals shrouded in occult myth and legend, there is perhaps no other figure in medieval scholarship as fascinating as the Alchemist. Hello everyone, my name is Kyle and welcome to Desks and Dorks. A couple of things: we bring you historical tabletop role-playing based on real scholarship and some other fun stuff. If you like what we do here, a couple of things: if you want to support us, all of the YouTube pleasantries go quite a long way, but you can also get digital PDFs by following that QR code or the links in the description below to our itch.io page. And if you're a fan of physical books, you can get them from our partners over at Tabletop Bookshelf. You can get them at Indie Press Revolution or Exalted Funeral. That's where you can purchase real, live, physical Desks and Dorks games. But with that out of the way, let's discuss the Alchemist. As always, I want to bring up that I was trained as a medievalist. I have a degree in medieval history. Now, I was a Eurocentric medievalist, and that matters way more than it usually does. This is the point where I point out, hey, those other time periods, those other cultures, those other places are worth studying and worth engaging with. It bears special mentioning because at the time of the Western European alchemists that I'm going to be mentioning, Arabic and Chinese alchemists were doing some absolutely bonkers things during this time period. You can thank an Arabic or a Chinese alchemist for things like gunpowder, porcelain, and modern pharmaceuticals. So again, that disclaimer does a lot more importance and a lot more heavy lifting than it usually does. Also, if you're going to lean into your more gruesome elements, I would encourage you to look into some safety tools. Just make sure that your players are doing okay. Make sure everyone feels welcome at your table. I think that's a pretty big deal. I don't think we're going to be covering anything super gruesome or shall we say, objectionable in today's video, but just in case. And lastly, we're going to be covering the purpose of alchemy, how alchemists were organized historically, some of their misconceptions, and lastly, how to use them in our games. And to do this, we have to address a very Jerry Seinfeld-esque question: what the heck's the deal with alchemists? You see, in alchemy, and particularly in scholarship that surrounds alchemy, there is a strange sort of conjoined image, a muddling of the dual images of what an alchemist is. You see, on the one hand, we have the alchemist as the scholar, the alchemist as the scientist, the alchemist as the craftsman, and it really does feel like in historical records, there are some alchemists that are driven not by gold, glory, a lust for power, or a comfortable life, but are driven by real scientific thought. They are chemists, astronomers, and philosophers, and depending on the historian that you read and the text that you are looking at, astronomer does seem to be a catch-all term for those individuals and the things that they study. One person who I think is actually hugely indicative is Hennig Brand. Hennig is a German alchemist in the late 1700s, or the early 1700s, I should say. 17th century, who actually managed to isolate phosphorus in his quest for the Philosopher's Stone. This is a hugely important thing because it goes on to help make additional chemical reagents and further scientific process, not just in Germany in the 1700s, but for the entire world. Now, this is difficult to parse because Hennig, like many alchemists of his time and prior to it, liked to keep things secret. You could say that he was Hennigmatic. Now, on top of the image of the alchemist as a natural philosopher and scientist, we have the alchemist as a mad lunatic, the alchemist as a strange sorcerer, a potion brewer, someone who consorts with forces far beyond their actual ability and beyond the mortal world. Now, partially this is due to their aims. There are three, in my research I could isolate three exact specific aims of the medieval alchemist. The first one is the isolation of the Philosopher's Stone, an element that, depending on the account and the historical record, was said to allow for the transmutation of elements, to extend the life of its user far beyond the actual parameters of a usual mortal life, and produce other minor miracles. The other thing that an alchemist is interested in is the transmutation of base metals, lesser metals, things like lead, into the quote-unquote noble metals like silver and gold. And lastly, the alchemist seeks, above all else, to extend their own lifespan. These three goals, while not being shared by every single medieval alchemist, were shared by enough of them And I do think that it goes quite a long way to explaining why we look at alchemists like these strange mad wizards and less like early or rudimentary chemists and scientists. But But this brings us to one really inherently important question, and that is, why is it that the image of the alchemist is so muddled? Why is it that it's divided between scientist and chemist, and lunatic and stark raving madman? And there's a number of reasons for this, but they all have to do with one very, very important thing, and that is secrecy. You see, the work of an alchemist was not something that was done usually in public. We'll get to those who did it in public in a little bit. Usually, however, there was a great degree of secrecy that was necessary into surviving and thriving in the profession. Some of that secrecy comes in the form of persecution and revisionism. The alchemist was seen, along with the witch, the demonologist, and the occultist, as an enemy of Christianity, and as a result of that, alchemists were both executed publicly and hunted privately by Christians in medieval Europe. This is a fate worse than death in some ways. They got very, very creative with some of the tortures for these alchemists, and as a result of that, the alchemist themselves is someone who has to do their experiments in secret, which means that our understanding and image of them is less clear, less well-defined, and B, the topic of tons of revisionism by Christian historians and writers. This means that alchemists who may or may not have been good and scientific individuals were probably displayed as less than reputable by the Christian sources that followed them. Again, it's important for us to understand that any challenge to the Roman Catholic Church as it stands in medieval Europe is deemed as a threat, and although in some cases the church was a great proponent of scientific progress and scientific theory, a great sponsor of scientists, scholars, and philosophers, there are times where it was equally a staunch enemy of those individuals. And in the case of the alchemist, that comes up often. The other one, however, is competition. You see, like rogue professors in a dark academia novel, alchemists weren't always competing to stay alive. They sometimes were competing for the attention and affection of noble patrons. That's right, alchemists in some ways were actually not, these hidden figures, but were out there in the public and actually doing things. This is especially true as we get into the Renaissance and later on into the 16 and 1700s. Now, this means that the alchemists had a vested interest in keeping their secrets safe from other alchemists. Why? Because if you got the contract with a noble, you got all of the noble patronage benefits that you wanted. Labs, equipment, and reagents for your alchemical processes are in fact very expensive. And something as well that I think gets overlooked is that there's some benefit to being seen as kind of a weirdo and a charlatan, right? There is an entertainment value to the alchemist in a noble's court that cannot, in many ways, be overlooked. These were entertainers in addition to being scholars, scientists, and in some cases legitimate madmen. There is an actual vested need to pretend or to play up your more eccentric traits in order to attract nobles who were like, yes, this is my weirdo, this is my little weirdo, and I keep him in a basement and I throw him ham scraps and money so he can buy funny glass bottles, which does in fact happen. Now, here's the thing. Being a weirdo, and I do mean that term, at least in this case, relatively lovingly, can come from two things. I just mentioned the idea that being this sort of weird character, playing up your own eccentricities as a way of entertainment is a thing, but also, more darkly, a lot of the things that alchemists were working with can lead to brain damage. This right here is, of course, lead, and I'm just going to give you this quote from the World Health Organization, but in particular, lead can permanently affect brain development. Now, this study was done on children, but I thought this was interesting. Behavioral changes, including reduced attention span, increased antisocial behavior, and reduced educational attainment. Having something actually impact your ability to study, your ability to want to venture out into society and work with others, and increasing your antisocial and behavioral changes. Man, does that all sound like a reclusive alchemist. And they weren't just working with lead, attempting to transmute it into gold. They were working with one of the most toxic chemicals in human history, which is mercury. Another wonderful thing that does its level best to drive a person absolutely insane. Couple this with the fact that many alchemists, again, because we have already mentioned, kept their labs secret and in the dark, sometimes literally in addition to figuratively, with very little ventilation, means that there's going to be a lot of, again, possibility for severe brain damage over a long period of time, which probably does go a long way to explain the eccentricities and strangeness of our beloved alchemist. And this is where we get into the tangent zone. I want to just go on a really quick historical tangent because one of the things that I love is etymology. And some of you have probably heard the phrase as mad as a hatter, or are familiar with the Mad Hatter from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, or more commonly, the Disney adaptation of it, which is just Alice in Wonderland. Now, the Mad Hatter and the idea of being mad as a hatter comes from a very dark, very real historical place. You see, the idea of being a hatter, of creating hats, trying on hats, tailoring hats to fit the heads of English gentlemen, was a very real profession. However, one of the very real consequences of that profession was that you were constantly exposed to mercury, which was the chemical that they used to treat the bands inside of the hats. And because you were the one trying them on for the most part, or at least getting them sized and working with them, that mercury would seep into the heads and the skin of the hatters, slowly leading to brain damage and insanity. It is legitimately where the phrase mad as a hatter comes from, because so many hatters in England started to fall ill to the problems of mercury that it became a part of the English lexicon, and then went on to inspire a popular literary character. I thought this was kind of neat, and also kind of helps to inform the, shall we say, long-lasting and severe effects of the chemicals that these individuals were working with, which I think is pretty interesting. The other thing that helps to muddle them, however, are real-world charlatans, people who played up their occult powers, their understanding of the dark forces of the world, and as a result, hope to sort of cast a shadow over alchemy as a profession. I'm just going to bring up Alessandro di Cagliostro, which is not his real name, by the way, but he was an Italian con man, occultist, confidence player, and a number of different things. But this guy, among his repertoire of being a criminal, decided that he was going to pretend to be an alchemist, and in many cases would lead people on wild goose chases in order to get either access to rare alchemical reagents. They were not rare, they were usually just household elements, or attempting to use both alchemy and occult magic to help lead people to treasure, which did not exist, and usually when he got you out into the wilderness where the treasure was supposedly kept, you were then beaten unconscious and he would take your stuff. This is one of the funniest things because he ambushes a dude in Italy, and the guy wakes up thinking that he wasn't ambushed by Cagliostro. He thinks that he was ambushed by the spirits protecting the treasure, and he goes on believing this for like days until he realizes that Alessandro di Cagliostro is just gone. It takes him until he realizes that this dude has just dipped and left town to be like, oh my gosh, this guy wasn't real and I didn't get jumped by evil spirits. One of my favorite historical things, but individuals like de Cagliostro and perhaps another individual that we'll be mentioning later, the Count de Saint-Germain, all help to inspire the sort of muddled perception of the medieval alchemist. But now that we've established why alchemists sort of have the reputation that they do and why there is this constant flip-flop between these two very different images of the alchemist in pop culture, we need to talk about what the duties of the alchemist were in a professional setting. First and foremost, the idea of the alchemist and their overarching goal when it comes to transmutation and to, attempting to turn some of the base metals into the noble ones, falls entirely in the form of creating wealth. There are many alchemists throughout history who were contracted by their employers for the simple purpose of getting their employers filthy freaking rich. Now, obviously, no one was able to truly transmute lead to gold or to find the Philosopher's Stone, but there are some alchemists that managed to exceed, or succeed at the very least, in this endeavor. One of these fine individuals is this man right here, and I talked a little bit about porcelain and its importance to the Chinese alchemists of the world, but this is Johann Friedrich Böttger. Now, he was an alchemist who helped deliver or discover a form of porcelain to help undercut the Chinese market. At the time of Böttger's discovery, China had a monopoly on porcelain production, and it was seen as not only a massive status symbol, but it was so hard to get access to because of the way that the Imperial Chinese government constricted trade that it was ludicrously expensive, and many nobles, in some cases monarchs and kings, tried to get their alchemists to make a solution. Botker discovered that you could in fact make a soft paste version of this using animal bones and the calcium from those bones to create English bone china. Really an important thing, but it was kind of neat and brought a great deal of wealth and a new avenue of trade into Western Europe. Now, I've included this slide right here from a wonderful play called The Alchemist, which I thought was very fitting for us, because like this play, sometimes an alchemist's biggest thing was entertainment. Look, I know that you know that human beings can be some of the strangest, weirdest, and most vain individuals possible, and if you were a noble with enough money to throw around to bankrupt a small kingdom, why wouldn't you just want to have a funny little guy to brag to all of your friends? Remember, there are many alchemists who would use their basic understanding of rudimentary chemistry and science as essentially parlor tricks. They would play up the notions of their findings. They would play up their weird, mysterious, and eccentric nature, and they would do so in a public setting so that when their employer called upon them, they would be able to wheel in their strange contraptions to the oohing and eyeing of their employer's friends, rivals, and peers. Literally, busting out an alchemist was, the 16th century equivalent of busting out some Fetty Wap on the JBL speaker, and I think that that's absolutely freaking phenomenal. And last but certainly not least, we cannot discount that some alchemists did legitimately believe in trying to get science. Look, I might be dunking on the idea of attempting to transmute quote-unquote base metals into noble ones. I might believe in the dubious proposition of trying to find something that would extend your life in the way that the Philosopher's Stone would. However, it is abundantly clear to me that there are at least several alchemists that, in addition to these things which we might scoff at, did legitimately try to further human scientific progress in phenomenal and fantastic ways. And yes, we might laugh at some of these individuals because their understanding of the world was flawed. However, I am going to say right now that I would caution anyone who wants to do that. Look, we have a lot of foundational knowledge that you and I take for granted. Knowledge that had to be earned by individuals who messed around and found out. And ultimately, that's what this last class of alchemist is doing. Some of the alchemists were doing it for the money, some were doing it for the perks, but there are a couple alchemists in human history that were doing it for the love of the game. And by the love of the game, I mean furthering human scientific progress and understanding. And I think that's a really cool thing to take into account. Yes, there are some weird ones, there are some charlatans, there are some alchemists who were clearly in it just for the money. But there were alchemists who clearly used that money, that social clout, and their position to help further their own scientific aims and, by extension, further the scientific growth of the human world. And I think that that's pretty amazing. But with that comes the completion of our primer on the historical alchemist and the beginning of our discussion on Alchemists in Our Games. Now, in the Q&A section on Discord and in the YouTube community tab, a lot of you told me that you were sick and tired of the tropes surrounding alchemists and alchemy in general. You had seen enough of the wizened old scholar, of the reclusive sage, of the evil scientist living and lurking within some fortress of black obsidian. And honestly, I get that, right? That is a pretty one-dimensional view of the historical alchemist, who in many ways is a charlatan, a world traveler, a philosopher, a debutante, and a number of different things that are all compelling and interesting, far more so, I think, than the stereotypes that usually get presented in our games. And so what I am going to present to you now are 3 different concepts for alchemical ideas in your games that can be combined or utilized in any system, and they run the gamut from character concepts to adventure seeds to general overview of theme. And so with that out of the way, let's talk about our first alchemist. This is the reagent hunter. Think of this as the alchemist on the fringes, the alchemist in the wild, the swamps, the bayous, the deep, dark, foreboding forests. This is an alchemist who is looking for and is interested in rare herbs, animals, and other minerals that can be used as reagents. Now, this is a character concept, and one that I think is interesting if you want to allow adventurer alchemists. One of the problems with alchemy in general is that it's going to require specific reagents and a lab in order to see any progress, and I like the idea of a reagent hunter, because it allows an adventurer to take alchemy on the road, swapping out necessary ingredients with random things that they scrounge from their surroundings. Think of this kind of like a mix between Bill Nye the Science Guy and MacGyver, just in a fantasy setting. Eventually, however, for those individuals who stick with the reagent hunter path, not only will they be able to swap out one or even multiple ingredients for their potions, but they'll be able to gain one of these three benefits, either doubling duration, increasing intensity, or allowing a potion to be drank at no cost or danger to the wearer, or user, I should say, but they'll be able to do that whenever they're making use of these sort of improvised and impromptu potions. I think that's a really cool idea, and again, it allows your players to take alchemy on the road with them. But I wanted to lean in and throw a little homage to our Arabic alchemist friends who were so important to the world of modern pharmaceuticals, and I wanted to combine one of the elements of Arabic folklore with the elements of alchemy as a nod to them, as an homage to that culture. And the one that I'm going to do is actually called the Alchemy. This is kind of an alchemist-based gin. Now, instead of living in an oil lamp or a bottle, it resides within an almost finished masterpiece. And what that is a masterpiece of alchemy. So it could live in a bottle of unused reagents. It could live in a half-brewed poultice. It could live within the cracks of an ancient cauldron, the ruins of a laboratory. It could roost inside a schematic or a blueprint for an unfinished scientific apparatus that could have changed the world. And it does grant wishes, but it only grants them when the player is moving and working towards scientific progress. Now, you can do a couple things with this. I like this as a storyline concept, right? The player could receive dreams of schematics or recipes as long as they have possession of the alchemy or are in the area that the alchemy is trapped within, right? Especially if you're using the ruins of that laboratory idea. But what I think is the best way to do this is if a player is able to gain the benefits of the alchemy, they can replicate spells, and what I think is really better is monstrous abilities using alchemy. This opens up a range of adventure possibilities, right? Consider an evil alchemist who has trapped an alchemy and in doing so abused their blessing. Think about how terrifying it would be to come to a village and you think everyone is just a random peasant, and maybe they are, maybe they go down quickly just like a regular weak peasant would, but they all have the ability to breathe fire like a dragon because the evil alchemist has imbued them with those potions courtesy of the alchemy. Or if the players have an alchemy as one of their allies, think of how cool it would be for the players to have a Swiss Army knife of options from low-level monstrous abilities and powers. I think this would be really cool in Vaesen, by the way. If you had something like this, because Vaesen's all about the monster hunting, it would be really fascinating. This would go hard in Morkborg as well, although I think this would look a lot more demented in Morkborg. But the idea of getting access to a Swiss Army knife of abilities and powers, I think is also really cool and also particularly neat. But lastly, I wanted to address the entertainer in the room, the charlatan in the room, the showman in the room, right? The idea that the alchemist is this sort of kept individual at the behest of the nobility, I think is a really interesting one, and ultimately it's one that I want to address with our new character, Talago. You see, Talago is the charlatan of charlatans. He is an alchemist in air quotes. He's an individual who works for a prominent noble, but is very clearly doing this not for the love of science, not even really for the love of money. He's just doing it because the dude loves to put on a good show. He is the theater kid cranked up to 40. He is the Vegas residency, just with a lot more potions and the whiff of sulfur about him, right? He's not really doing this for scientific progress or the betterment of mankind or even the betterment of his own purse strings. He's just a dude who's in it for the love of the entertainment that he can provide. Now, despite proclaiming himself to be the charlatan of charlatans, a man with no power and only a wealth of cheap miracles produced by basic chemistry, there's one glaring issue. Talago is in fact an incredibly powerful wizard. So powerful, in fact, he makes Shadow Wizard Money Gang look kind of like a weak little bunch of Harry Potter rejects. Now, here's the thing. The players in this adventure seed that I have cooked up are contracted by Talago, not to help him defeat an enemy, not to help him get even with a political rival. No, they're there to help cover for him because the dude literally can't stop oozing magic everywhere he goes, which means the players are going to have an entire campaign of solving puzzles, of using roleplay, of finding creative solutions to problems in order to disguise the fact that this man is a literal magical demigod who only wants to be the equivalent of a dinner theater magician. And I think that's actually one of my favorite adventure seeds that I have ever done. I love a game like this that forces the players to sort of consider what they might do differently, to find creative solutions to problems, because again, Talago wants to live in this community. So if the players just start dropping bodies, they don't get paid, and they could also tick off the very powerful god level caster in their midst. I think this is a fantastic idea for a game, and it's somewhere between like The Hangover and Weekend at Bernie's, but just with like a lot more lightning bolts. I think is exactly what I'm envisioning here, and I think it would be a fantastic campaign, especially when maybe one of Talago's rivals gets loose in his lab and threatens to reveal his secret. That's up to you as the game master or the players, but I would highly encourage you to do this one. This is probably one of my favorite game ideas for Alchemists, or just in general, that I've cooked up in a video in quite a long time. And with that, my friends, it brings us to the end of our video proper. Again, if you like what we do here, that QR code on the screen will take you to our itch.io page, or you could just get those games at the itch.io page in the description below. Of course, if you want physical copies, you can get them from Tabletop Bookshelf, you can get them from Indie Press Revolution or Exalted Funeral. All of those things help us out immensely, as do the YouTube pleasantries of liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. As always, there is a Q&A section following this video, but if you're not interested in the Q&A and you just wanted the historical and game stuff, then this is where we part ways. But until next time, I am Kylot from Desks and Dorks. You have all been absolutely amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Hello, Dad Bod. We did it. Made it through another one, folks. How are you? We are going to be doing the Q&A section. If you want to be a part of the Q&A section next time, all you have to do is join the Discord, links in the description below, or vote on the post tab, and that is the best way that you could join our Discord, and you can contribute to conversations exactly like this one. Now, I'm going to go on over a couple ones. Let's start with Ross Blasks. Ross, blah, blah, blah. I can't speak words. By the way, if you're new, this is the unedited section. This is very conversational, so you're going to watch me stumble over some stuff that I usually wouldn't. Ross Blaziks, I hope that's right. That sounds Polish AF, my friend. 8238 said, from reading books by Deborah Harkness on the subject of alchemy, admittedly looking at a more Renaissance era, thinking of alchemy, it seems alchemists were trying to reach repeatable procedure through philosophical understanding. That is a beautiful way of putting that. Yes, I would agree. How can we work a similar idea into our fantasy RPGs? Do we develop a system of collecting monster bits and being able to produce them into potions in a reputable manner? And I think it really just depends on what you are trying to get accomplished, Ross, as a game master, and what your game is trying to do with the Alchemist. For example, I think you could make an entire role-playing game about alchemists who are not reputable, who are doing this in really shady and shifty and strange ways. And I think that would be a really interesting way of playing that out. That would be a pretty fun way of doing it. You could also create just a singular NPC that the players are trying to do what they think is really sketchy work, but it turns out they're really doing it for a reputable source, and that's a way that you could make it work. I don't think that you necessarily have to overhaul it as an entire system in your game, but I do think it would be intriguing and interesting at the very least if you consider what parts of your story you're trying to tell, what you want the players to walk away from your table having experienced, and then try the ideas of alchemy and alchemical processes into that from there. I think that's a good idea. Cy Brandier asked, historically, magic has been, to my understanding, always been a way to understand, but maybe more importantly, control the unknown and the extra planar. It's probably not a bad way of looking at it. Certainly one way that human beings have treated magic in the past. Meanwhile, in TTRPGs having to be bound by the rules, we see that a player could quote-unquote know everything about magic, possibly leaking down to their characters or how magic is seen at the world at large. It is kind of like what the tech tree is to science IRL. My questions are then, do we, from a game design perspective, want to change this to better reflect what it once was? And if so, how? Now, that's another great question, Cybrainer, and I'm going to come at it from two prongs. One is I don't necessarily think we have to change it if we don't want to change it. There is, by the way, I love your profile picture because it's a giant, dumb-looking grizzly bear, and grizzly bears are like my favorite animal, and they're the best, and they're big and silly and goofy, and I love those little doobers. Very important, though. Very, very, very important to think about. If you are attempting to change how magic in the world works and what magic in the world does, and I do think that's interesting and an intriguing concept, the thing is, do you want the undertaking to be the sole focus of your game? Because I think it would have to be, right? Your players challenging the notion of what arcane understanding is, pushing forward and attempting to make things work from there. That's a massive undertaking, and ultimately one I think that would be the sole crux of a game, no matter what system you're playing. So I think you could necessarily, if you wanted to do that, absolutely do that. Like, yeah, I think that's a really good idea. But again, I think that would be something that you would have to have the whole thing be like, the whole thing I think would have to be that. So I hope that that's a good answer to that question. And now, let us move on to the Discord, because the Discord asked a bunch of things. Shout out to Rothier Magus. Thank you, sir, for, compiling all of these. As what happens sometimes is that the Desks and Dorks community tends to meme a little bit, and sometimes we meme in the Q&A section, so I appreciate you, Rothier, for collating these into a list. From Cadme, why did so many people think drinking mercury would impart immortality instead of killing them like it does everyone else? There is the human desire to think that they're built different, right? Like, if everyone around you is saying that this is a magical elixir of life, but, it requires a special person, and then you're like, it's me, I'm the special person, hi, I'm the problem, it's me. I think that's part of it. I also think, too, mercury can, in small doses, be used to, like, kill living things, kill living tissue, so I think it plays into a poor understanding of, like, what is and isn't a threat in a microbial sense. Like, we were using mercury in medicine here in the United States up until, like, very recently, like in world history. Like, we can track the Lewis and Clark expedition here in the United States by the deposits of mercury left where their latrines were, because it was a common STD cure. So I also think this is not modern, but medieval medicine mixing with culture and the natural human belief that, no, guys, it's fine, I'm built different. No, you're not. So yeah. Rothier Mage has asked, probably going to be answered in the video itself, but here it goes. How could we take historical alchemy and make it relevant to our games outside of Guy in a shop selling a potion? I really think, Rothier, and yeah, I did lean into this with the kind of monsters I made, or not monsters I made, but the individuals I made and the adventure seeds that I think you could use, really lean into those social consequences and the social benefits of alchemy and the alchemist in general. The alchemist is not just, random guy in a hut somewhere. He can be a courtesan, an advisor, a political mover and shaker. I think all of those are great ways to do it. As well. The adjudicator asked, were there instances in which alchemy-based curative or other recommendations were marketed towards the populace as a form of religious or political control? Not that I can think of, but there were multiple. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. Maybe not political control, adjudicator, but there was, I think, one or two known cases where a Roman alchemist was unalived because they had ways to make porcelain or make other substances that were valuable to the Roman Republic, and rather than, it was actually more economically expedient for the emperor to end them rather than try to overhaul the system. So even though these alchemists were bringing an ostensibly cheaper and better version of a desirable product, their lives and the stamping out of those discoveries was deemed to be more economically expedient. The other thing now, so that's like more economic. I guess that is kind of political control as well. But in terms of religious control, I think the opposite is obviously true, Adjudicator. I think there were quite a lot of alchemists who were sort of stamped out by the Catholic Church, just in general, as a way to sort of keep them down. So, Rothier Magus asked, is it useful to have a separation between alchemy and herbalism, like in D&D, or can we classify them as being the same thing? I think, in my mind, Rothier, I think I would have them be different. And not because, like, there can't be some overlap, and that would be interesting if there was. Like, I guess if I was redesigning Dungeons & Dragons skill trees, I would start at, like, potion mixing, or just mixing as, like, a skill, right? Maybe not mixing, but, like, base chemistry as a skill, and then maybe have that chemistry go into alchemy or herbalism from there. Because they are... They cover different ground, but they do have enough similarities that I can see them... being not the same thing, but maybe different things. Different branches from a spliced tree, I guess, is probably the best way to look at it. It sometimes feels, oh, by the way, a little Western European superiority when we talk about alchemy. We automatically go to medieval European text, the guy in the lab doing pre-modern science, but then often ascribe herbalism as a lesser supervision that those other people who are not as sophisticated as us do. I would agree with this 100%, Rothier. It's one of the reasons that I kind of put my disclaimer in at the beginning that, like, I was trained as a Eurocentric medievalist. Like, that's what the majority of, like, the primary texts that I read were, and, like, that's what the bulk of the resources I had access to, like, real, honest-to-God, like, historical resources and anecdotal evidence and, like, first, and primary evidence, right? That's the stuff I had access to. So I think you're 1,000% right, by the way, that bias exists. There is a lot of herbalism that gets discounted as, like, Eastern quackery. It was one of the really sort of, like, racially coded things that I have heard about the contributions of Chinese alchemists in particular, which I think is really interesting. Fun fact about snake oil, which I think I will actually make sure that I go back and add its own thing. Snake oil salesman kind of sucks as a term because, like, so the origin of snake oil salesman, I promise it, Rothier, this does matter. But, like, a snake oil salesman in the Wild West is somebody who sells you, a bunk tonic, a not working potion or poultice or whatever, right? And they would literally just take random snakes and, like, just, put them in liquid. That's kind of where it comes from. But the reason that people started to do that is the Chinese immigrants who worked on the railroad had a homemade remedy that uses the lung snake, which is native to China, as an anti-inflammatory liquid, and it actually does work. So what happened was people here in the West saw what the Chinese immigrants were doing and that it was working, and then decided to rip off their cure to sell as a, potentially harmful at worst and absolute bunk at best health product. Which means that not only is it not the Chinese person's fault for that, we just managed to codify and co-opt an actual thing and then just make it way more racist and make it screw up, which I think is indicative of some of the trends that you're talking about. So, is interesting. So, yeah. Mass Bandit. Were there any other particularly lofty goals of alchemy besides turning things to gold, making elixir of life, philosopher's stone, and porcelain as well? By the way, I know I mentioned Botker in the presentation, but yeah, porcelain was like public enemy number one in Europe in the 1700s and 1600s, or in the late 1600s, mid 1600s. It's like public enemy number one for alchemists to try to tackle. So yeah, Adjudicator, were people trying to, like, learn how to fly and breathe underwater and do all the D&D spells with alchemy? Kind of, in some ways. Like, again, I think there's something just about these people that there's, like, they want to do something different, and it's kind of cool. Rothier says, in connection with Adjudicator's question, was there any connection between medieval alchemy and ceremonial magic? Yes, all magic, I think, in some ways is ceremonial, or in some ways is ritual-based, right? A somatic component in D&D, the waving of hands, the chanting of certain proper words, that is a ritual, right, in some small way, shape, or form. So there definitely is a connection between medieval ritual and magic, especially because some alchemists saw themselves as sorcerers and scientists, as philosophers and scholars, as poets and entertainers in addition to being chemists. So yeah, there's a tons of connection there, I think. And were people trying to use alchemy to gain such powers similar to the use of the Goetia and the Keys of Solomon? I would say probably not the Keys of Solomon necessarily. I think demons and the subjugation of spirits was more of an occult practice. Now, there are a lot of occultists who were alchemists, so I'm sure there was some bleed over in the techniques and again in the ritual of it. But it seems that their aims were squarely focused on the physical world. I will say one of the texts that I read, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now, involves like the use of human hosts and parts of the human soul as a reagent. So could be something there, but I don't think that's entirely true. Man, Rothier Media's popping off with a bunch of these questions. Also, what was the mortality rate of alchemists? High. Just higher than you would think. Higher. How prevalent were alchemists in war within the times of antiquity and the medieval period? In the medieval period, Rothier, not as high as you might be thinking. In antiquity, not an alchemist, but like people like Archimedes really did try to like do their level best to like make super weapons for people. One of my favorite parts about the Second Punic War is that Hannibal Barca, who's my favorite historical figure of all time, is in many cases a rudimentary chemist. Like there's one story of him essentially exploding a boulder on his way through the Alps. And it was very clear, like upon rereading of that source, like and again, this is the conjecture zone for a second, but like the prevailing conjecture, which makes a lot of sense, is that he was basically just using fermented alcohol from like the men's wine skins, in addition to other chemicals that they just had lying around, and then using them and exploiting the cracks in said boulder to literally just blow it up after it was structural integrity was compromised, and the flammable, as the gas and the fire expanded, the pressure of that actually split the boulder in half. So in Hannibal in many ways is like a chemist, which I think is cool. Also, he built a snake catapult, which I'm not going to elaborate on, but maybe I'll talk about it later. And lastly, what do you think about the Portrait of the Alchemist is the show Full Metal Alchemist compared to the historical depictions? I think, and I love Full Metal Alchemist, one of the best animes I've ever watched, or best anime I've ever watched. I guess the anime is the plural of anime, isn't it? It's not a sentence I thought I'd say as an adult, but here we are. I think Full Metal Alchemist is like how dorky, edgy, I've been huffing lead too long alchemists probably wanted to see themselves. I don't think it's very accurate, except for the idea of like state-run alchemy at the behest of like the ruling class is pretty on par. But other than that, I think it's not necessarily a great thing. And then Conrad Harris 8167 asked, I typically run alchemy as a non-magical science, simply using ingredients not found in our world. Would you say that is more or less aligned with the history of alchemy than the more traditional view of alchemy being in some way magical? I think it would be really hard, Conrad, to separate the sorcery from the science and the science from the sorcery. I talked at length, obviously, about how muddled the perception of the alchemist was and is in our own pop cultural and historical imagination and record. And I think, we covered a bunch of the reasons why that is, but I think ultimately a lot of alchemists saw themselves just like a Miley Cyrus, man. They wanted the best of both worlds. And so I think you can make alchemy like just a baseline chemistry with stuff that exists outside of this plane of reality, and I think that's totally fine. But I'll be honest, if you are an individual who really wants to like hew closer to that source material, then I will have to say I think that you would, I think you would want to combine them all. I think that's a good call. So in any case, that is going to be almost it. I am going to look for one more question. I'm going to pause here while I find it. All right, and I'm back. I had to pause. I couldn't find the original commenter's name, but I did record it in my notes. And I'm very sorry, original commenter, that I cannot remember your name to shout you out for all of this. But you had mentioned how in earlier video we talked about sieges, and I know this is the alchemy video, but I wanted to answer your question. I feel terrible for having missed it because I realized that you commented forever ago. So how would a world where undead is prevalent, how would that matter during a siege? I'm just going to answer it now because it deserves its own answer. Again, my apologies for not finding you sooner, buddy. And I guess it depends on a couple different things. And we can relate it to alchemy too, right? Because, you know, a lot of the chemical reactions and chemical things that would be very harmful to humans would not be harmful to the undead. In a world where there are undead sieges, I imagine there would be quite a lot more smaller forts. And I think the construction of forts would change in general, right? I think one of the things that we take for granted about the building of castles is the idea that there needs to be a place for... there needs to be a place for food and supplies to allow defenders, but if you have undead that don't need to feed, skeletons, zombies, that kind of thing, then I think that's going to change the landscape of, literally the landscape of how castles are built and how they are stocked and provisioned. The other thing I think to take into account, if undead are big in your setting, and you want to have them play a major part in the defense of that place, is how does siege attacks work, right? Because most sieges were won by just starving the defending party out, or were won by the defending party when relief force came. You can't really starve out an undead army, so I think that means, and potentially they turn to alchemy to do it, right? Like, you know, the idea of these catapults throwing, you know, acid or quicklime, stuff that would slowly rot away at the integrity of necrotically revived bones would be interesting. So I think in general, new attack strategies would have to come into play, new defense strategies would have to come into play, or ultimately it could just be like the medieval version of US drone warfare, where we just have like a bunch of unmanned skeletons and zombies running around battling each other while the real humans are 5 miles away in their village controlling their little undead combat puppets. Who knows? That would be my take on that, though. Again, commenter, I'm sorry I don't remember your name. I was looking for it. I realized I wanted to address it in the last video. I told you I would, and I didn't. I failed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But no, it was an interesting question, and it deserved a full deep dive there. And with that, my friends, I think that is the end of our Q&A section. I am Kyle, as always, for Desks and Dorks. You guys are amazing. Seriously, though, please pick up some games. It is the single best way to help me and help the team, help Desks and Dorks grow. All of that stuff is greatly, greatly appreciated. If you don't have it within you to make a purchase, times are tough financially. I get it. All of the YouTube pleasantries, liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing, those are all free, and they help us out immensely because it's how, you know, I get more attraction and more attention from advertisers. So with that out of the way, I'm Kyle for Desks and Dorks. Y'all are amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.